What you're watching unfold right now isn't just a weapons procurement delay. It's the clearest, most brutally honest signal yet that America's grand strategy is fracturing under the weight of its own ambitions. And the people who will feel that fracture most aren't in Washington, they're in Tokyo, in Taipei, and in every command center across the Pacific, where military planners are quietly doing the math and not liking the answers they're getting. Japan's order for roughly 400 Tomahawk missiles, a cornerstone of Tokyo's new long-range strike strategy, is now being disrupted because Washington has burned through those inventories in the war against Iran. And when you sit with that reality for more than 30 seconds, you begin to understand that this isn't just a scheduling problem. This is a window into the soul of American power in the 21st century, what it can do, what it cannot sustain, and where the seams are beginning to show in ways that no press briefing will ever fully acknowledge. Before Operation Epic Fury opened on February 28, 2026, the United States was producing roughly 60 Tomahawk cruise missiles per year. The Center for Strategic and International Studies estimates that in the first 100 hours of that campaign alone, U.S. forces fired 168 Tomahawk missiles, nearly 3 full years of peacetime production, gone in less than 5 days. Let that sink in. 3 years of manufacturing capacity erased in the opening hours of one operation, and it didn't stop there. The U.S. Navy has fired more than 850 Tomahawk missiles in the war with Iran, prompting internal Pentagon discussions about how to make more missiles available. That number is not a typo. That is not a misprint. That is the reality of modern high-intensity conflict, and it is a reality that Washington has been warned about for years and still was not fully prepared for when the moment arrived. Now, the reason this matters far beyond the Middle East, the reason this story connects directly to the future of American security, to the future of your security as an American, is what it means for the Indo-Pacific. This conflict is drawing in supplies and troops at the expense of defending against Washington's primary strategic rival, China. That is not commentary from a fringe analyst. That is the core finding coming out of the most respected defense think tanks in this country, and it deserves to be heard clearly and without the fog of political spin. The entire architecture of American deterrence in the Pacific rests on the credibility of American firepower. And right now, that credibility is being spent down in the skies over Iran while Beijing watches every launch, counts every missile, and updates its own planning assumptions accordingly. The concern from some in the Pentagon about burning through the Tomahawk stockpile is less about what will happen in Operation Epic Fury and more about the effect on other theaters, particularly the Western Pacific and a potential conflict against China, with strategists very worried that depletion of inventories will weaken the ability to deter or fight a conflict there. Now think about what that actually means in plain terms. The men and women responsible for defending this country are sitting in rooms right now having conversations about whether they have the tools they need to prevent a Chinese move on Taiwan. And the honest answer coming back is less so than we did before February 28th. That is the conversation America is not having publicly, but absolutely needs to have. Japan's $235 billion order signed in 2024 was one of the largest foreign purchases of these missiles. Japanese Defense Minister Shinjiro Koizumi confirmed in March that a first shipment had been received. However, the United States has now indicated its priority is to ensure supplies for the war in Iran. And here is where the geopolitical reality becomes painfully instructive. Japan made this investment, this enormous financial and strategic commitment, because it looked at China, looked at North Korea, looked at the trajectory of the region, and made a rational decision that it needed to be able to reach out and strike an adversary's territory if circumstances required it. That decision was made in consultation with Washington. It was encouraged by Washington. And now Washington is telling Tokyo that the weapons it paid for, the weapons it planned its entire counterstrike doctrine around, are going to be late because they've been fired into Iran. The message that sends to every American ally, not just Japan, is one that no diplomat can paper over with careful language. The U.S. military has a stockpile of roughly 4,000 to 4,150 Tomahawk cruise missiles. The approximately 400 missiles already fired constitute 10% of the entire U.S. inventory. Production remains low, with only 57 new missiles requested in the 2026 budget. These were expended in just 3 days of combat operations. That rate of usage is is unsustainable. Now, when a former military officer looks at those numbers, what he sees isn't just a logistics problem. He sees a fundamental mismatch between the pace at which America consumes military power in conflict and the pace at which the industrial base can replace it. The United States military was designed and funded for a world where conflicts were relatively short, where adversaries were significantly outmatched, and where the magazine depth of American forces never truly needed to be tested at scale. That world is gone, and the transition to a new reality has been far slower than the threat environment has demanded. A Payne Institute report estimated it will take at least 5 years to replenish the Tomahawks fired in just the first 16 days of the Iran conflict. In those same 16 days, the U.S. fired 535 Tomahawk missiles, nearly 17% of the estimated supply, at a cost, at current unit prices, of roughly $1.9 billion worth of missiles alone. 5 years. 5 years to replace what was spent in 16 days. And during those 5 years, the world does not pause. China does not pause. North Korea does not pause. The threats that Japan was trying to equip itself against with those 400 Tomahawks don't take a 5-year sabbatical while Raytheon ramps up production lines. This is the fundamental strategic dilemma that no one in official Washington seems willing to state plainly. The United States is fighting today in a way that is borrowing against tomorrow's security, and the bill is going to come due in a theater that matters far more in the long run. To address looming shortages, the U.S. government has entered several agreements with defense companies to accelerate production. Following the start of Operation Epic Fury, Trump said he had asked defense companies to quadruple production of what he called exquisite class weapons, including Patriots, THAADs, and Tomahawks. Experts note, however, that it will be 3 or 4 years before the additional production arrives, given the long wait times for these particular systems. Quadruple production, that is a headline that sounds decisive and reassuring until you understand the timeline involved. 3 to 4 years. And that assumes no further significant conflicts drain the inventory in the meantime. That assumes the defense industrial base can actually execute at that scale, which is far from guaranteed given the supply chain vulnerabilities that have been documented for years, but never fully addressed. There are significant vulnerabilities due to China's domination of key markets, including China's near monopoly on rare earth metals that are critical for manufacturing various missiles and munitions. China also dominates the advanced battery supply chain across the globe. So here is the exquisite irony of the situation. The United States is trying to rebuild its missile inventories to deter and potentially defeat China, and to do so, it is dependent on materials and supply chains that China largely controls. The critical minerals required to build those guidance systems, those seekers, those turbofan engines, gallium, germanium, rare earths, China holds extraordinary leverage over the supply of those materials. And Beijing knows it. It would be naive in the extreme to believe that China is not thinking carefully about how and when to use that leverage as tensions over Taiwan continue to build. The vast majority of long-range weapons and interceptors employed against Iran are just as vital to deterrence and warfighting requirements in the Indo-Pacific. And the United States and its allies in Asia are facing an even more acute shortage of high-end air defenses and long-range strike missiles in what many believe to be the window of highest risk of a potential major Chinese military move against Taiwan. The window of highest risk. Those are not words chosen carelessly by serious analysts. They reflect a growing consensus in the defense and intelligence community that the period we are in right now, the mid to late 2020s, represents a point of genuine danger, a moment when Chinese military capabilities are peaking relative to American readiness, when American stockpiles are being drawn down in a conflict that was not anticipated in the original deterrence calculus for the Pacific, and when the decisions being made today will determine whether the next decade is one of relative stability or catastrophic miscalculation. 4 former senior U.S. defense officials have said the low stockpile problem is most acute in inventories of high-end interceptors that are a key part of deterrence against China in the Indo-Pacific, where the United States Navy maintains a large presence to protect allies, including Taiwan, against an encroaching Chinese Navy. 4 former senior defense officials. These are not political commentators. These are people who spent careers inside the system, who understand its strengths and its limitations at the deepest level, and who are now speaking publicly because they believe the situation is serious enough to warrant it. When men and women of that background speak with one voice about a structural risk, the responsible thing is to listen, not to dismiss their warnings as alarmism or partisan positioning. The deeper truth here, the truth that the Tomahawk delay story reveals if you're willing to follow it to its logical conclusion, is that the United States is attempting to maintain global military dominance simultaneously across the Middle East and the Pacific with an industrial base that was never fully rebuilt after the Cold War. For 3 decades, the defense industrial complex was optimized for efficiency, not surge capacity. Production lines were consolidated, suppliers were reduced to single sources, and the assumption baked into nearly every procurement decision was that America would never truly need to fight a sustained, large-scale, high-intensity conflict against a peer adversary. That assumption has now been stress-tested. Not by China, but by Iran, and the results are not encouraging. The Center for Strategic and International Studies noted that the United States has fired more Tomahawk missiles during Operation Epic Fury than in any other military campaign in history, and that replenishing inventory after this campaign will take time and creates near-term risk for the United States. Ships cannot be reloaded at sea and would need to return to port once they are out of missiles. More Tomahawks than any campaign in history, and the ships that fired them cannot be reloaded at sea. They have to return to port, find the missiles, load them, and return to station, a process that takes weeks. In a high-intensity conflict with China in the Western Pacific, those weeks could be the difference between deterrence holding and deterrence failing. Every naval officer who has studied the Taiwan contingency understands this. Every honest analyst who has worked through the war games understands this. The question is whether the political leadership, the people who ultimately make these decisions, understand it with sufficient clarity to act before the window closes. Japan understood this when it invested $235 billion in Tomahawks. Tokyo looked at the trajectory of the region, made a clear-eyed assessment of the threat, and committed serious money to give itself a serious capability. What Japan could not have fully anticipated was that the allies selling it those missiles would need them first for a different war, in a different theater, for reasons that had nothing to do with the China challenge that both nations agree is the defining strategic problem of this era. More than 2 years' worth of combined production has been consumed so far in the Iran war alone. 2 years of production for a weapon that takes years to build and months to deliver. The gap between what is needed and what exists grows wider with each passing week of continued operations. What this moment demands is not panic, and it is not resignation. What it demands is honesty. The kind of honesty that American strategic culture has sometimes struggled to maintain when the gap between ambition and capability becomes uncomfortable to acknowledge. The United States cannot be everywhere, fight everyone, and maintain the depth of firepower necessary to deter its most capable adversaries simultaneously. That is not defeatism, that is arithmetic. And the sooner American leadership in the Pentagon, in Congress, in the White House, confronts that arithmetic directly and builds a strategy worthy of the actual resource constraints that exist, the better positioned this country will be to navigate a genuinely dangerous decade. The Tomahawk delay is not the crisis. The Tomahawk delay is the symptom. The crisis is the gap between what America has promised its allies and itself and what it can actually deliver. Closing that gap is the work of this generation, and the clock is running.